How do we know, Claire, that that COVID wasn't responsible for all the excess deaths?
Right, good question, Russell. So let's look at the whole COVID hypothesis. If we look at this, look at the 2022 column again, which is the third in. So we're going to use their official model of 19,945 excess deaths in 2022. And that, I said, was 66 plane crashes not investigated. Now, from ABS statistics of from and with COVID, that comes to 13,267 deaths. And this is what they are trying to say, we don't need to worry to look any further. So I'm saying even with that, we've still got more than that number. With, you know, the 19,945 is about 6,700 more that we haven't explained. But the idea of the deaths from and with is actually against what the WHO said itself. Since 1948, it is said that when we are doing tabulations of death statistics, we must use the underlying cause of death. So that means we don't include deaths with COVID. That's just a nonsense. That's not what the person died from. It's not in the chain of cause of events that killed that person. So we have to remove the deaths with COVID, and the ABS should not be including them on that graph. I think that is misleading. So we take out the deaths with COVID, and so these figures, the 13,267 deaths from and with, and the 2,966, and they're taken from the ABS's own reports on how many people died from and with COVID. So I think we should go down to the line where it says there were 10,301 deaths from COVID. And so at the most, we're accounting for 10,301 of the 19,945 deaths. But I think we need to think even harder about this. We shouldn't just say they died from COVID, we don't need to worry. Why did so many people die from COVID? Do you remember we were told that the vaccines would protect us from severe disease and death? So we need to be sure that we need to look at those deaths from COVID. We need to see and know and be told and release the data. Were those people vaccinated or not vaccinated? What, you know, if we find that the unvaccinated make up the vast majority of those deaths, then sure enough, then the jabs have worked. But if we find that actually vaccinated people make up a bigger proportion of those deaths than they do in the population, then that's worrying. That would mean that the vaccination has made perhaps it worse. Or we could have a situation where the vaccination has made no change at all. We find exactly the same proportion. So I think the Department of Health and Aged Care they have a duty, after telling us that these vaccines would help, they have a duty to prove to us with the actual raw data for all the COVID deaths that the vaccines did work. So those 10,301 deaths need to be investigated as part of the plane crash investigation, I think. But then there's more, because should we say that every COVID death is an excess death? So an excess death is an unexpected death, someone who has died prematurely. They shouldn't have died in 2022. Now, from the ABS's own data, more than half of the deaths from COVID were very, very old, frail people. The median age was 85.8 years. In other words, they were just about 86. In fact, the median age of death is less than that, 82 for deaths from all causes. So these were very old, very frail people. Now, the ABS and the Department of Health are saying, but they were all excess deaths. Well, no, those very old, very frail people, many of them, sadly, would have died in 2022 anyway from something else. They are just on the edge of leaving this world. And if it wasn't COVID, it could have been flu or a heart attack or heart failure. Something would have killed them anyway. So we can't allocate all those 10,301 to the excess deaths. And in fact, from some other work I've been doing on a project called Excess Death Stats, where we've been looking at statistics from different countries, one country we've looked at is Sweden. And that is very interesting because in Sweden in 2020, they didn't have lockdowns and COVID spread through the country. In that year, we calculate that they had 4,369 excess deaths in 2020 in Sweden, compared with the 5 years before the pandemic. But their health agencies report more than 10,000 deaths from COVID. So in other words, there were only 4,000 excess deaths and 10,000 deaths from COVID. And what that means is that only 43% of those deaths from it was from and with COVID they used, only 43% were real excess deaths. So if you use that, I calculate that 5,705 of those were real excess deaths from COVID. So I think we can only take 5,705 off that 19,945. And so that leaves 14,240 deaths that we don't know, excess deaths, unexpected premature deaths happened in 2022. This is the big picture. We need to ask why. What was it? What were the causes? And we need to be open-minded to possibilities. And we need to do the sort of thing Andrew's done. That's 47 plane crashes not accounted for. So that's how I feel that we should be looking at the COVID deaths.